Okay, so once my scalp is created and it's all clean, and I set my project, I'm ready to start my first groom. So in order to start XGen, you want to make sure that you have the XGen plugin loaded. If it doesn't show up here, you can go to Windows, Settings and Preferences Plugin Manager, and then find the XGen plugin. You want to go ahead and start the XGen by opening the XGen window. So you click on this button right here. It should open something like this. If you already had a description and some XGen in this file, it would already be on that XGen description, but if you don't have any, you'll see something like this. So what you want to do is we want to go ahead and click Create New Description. And so XGen has this kind of organization for how it handles your XGen grooms. So if you have multiple XGen grooms, this is going to, inside of a Maya file, this is how it's going to organize it. You're going to have a collection, that's at your top level, and then underneath the collection, you have a bunch of descriptions. So the descriptions, as I mentioned before, is kind of the different areas of unique hair that I've set up on that asset. So eyebrows, eyelashes, beard area, scalp, those would be separate descriptions. A collection would be, this is how I approach it at least, is a single asset. So I had like my character's head would be a collection, but then their clothes would be a different collection. They don't have to, it doesn't have to be one object, it can be multiple objects in one collection. And there are reasons why you want to have fewer collections, but generally speaking, that's how I separate it. But usually for this kind of project, if you're keeping it pretty small, you really only need one collection and maybe a couple of descriptions. So I'll click on New Description, bring that window back up. So I'm going to name it something descriptive. So I'm going to call this one hair. And then I like to use this _DESC for description. The reason being is sometimes description and collection will show up in like folders, or they'll show up inside of your outliner. And if you don't have a name like this, you might be like, what is that thing? So having that will give you a very clear indication of, oh, that's the description. So this one, I'll call this one head, COLL for collection. So again, this is like the head, all the descriptions that are going to be on the head. I called it head collection. Okay, so there's there's a couple ways that you could instance geometry. So you can use you don't have to just grow hair. You can instance geometry like scattering leaves or pebbles. We're not going to worry about these ones right here, these three. We're going to worry about just the hair. And so the hair, you're generally going to be using just these two approaches. You have splines, which is you're going to be growing the hairs and using either attributes to kind of change their shape, or you're going to be manually placing the hairs. Or you're going to be using groomable tools, which is going to use like a hairbrush that's essentially going to let you shape the hair in a very artistic way. So it's very useful for a lot of hair or fur. Like, you know, fur has a lot of directionality to it. So it's usually easier to use groomable splines for like fur. You can even see it says short hair, fur, grass, and then like longer hairs, or like hairs that you want really particular shapes on, like the eyebrows, right? You want a really particular shape. I think it's better to just use splines. So we're gonna start with splines. Usually just keep it randomly across the surface, totally cool. And there's two settings here, right? We can place and shape guides, right? Which is gonna be, we start the groom by placing down guides, or using attributes to control by expression. I'm gonna use this one, even though I typically don't use this one very often, but that's just because we'll get past guides for now. We'll come back to guides later. So go ahead and click on create. All right, and you'll see immediately your asset, if you had it selected when you created that, should start growing hair. If you didn't have your asset created, it'll come up with a message that says no bind patches or something similar to that. If that's the case, you just select the geometry, the scalp, and you go up here to description, bind patches, and add selected faces. Bind patches are essentially the polygons that you are growing your hair from. Okay, and so here's what our XGen window looks like. We have a couple things up here. This right here is going to be generate the preview of the hair. So these little brown hairs right here are the hair primitives that we're seeing. Under here we have update preview automatically. It's set to that. So if I come in here and change an attribute, you can see I don't need to have that mesh selected. You see when I go ahead and increase that density, it's going to go ahead and update it automatically. If for some reason there's a couple stages where you're going to want to turn off that update preview, especially when your file gets heavy, just click that. You can set this, and then you just click this button again, and it'll generate the preview. If you want to hide the hair for any reason, you can just click on that right there. When we get to guides, we're going to talk about this more, but these are going to be the placing guides when you place hair guides manually, and this is toggling the visibility of them, and it has a few more things like mirroring them across, etc., etc. Okay, down here we have a couple tabs separated by their function. So primitives is going to be controlling all of the general shaping of, let's go ahead and turn that preview back on. There we go. That's going to be changing, like, how many hairs we have, how long they are, the width of them, if the width changes at all, and then like the parting. This right here is going to be like if you create a part in your hair, but we'll talk about that later. Preview is going to be how we view it. So you can see right here, this is my preview percentage. So in the viewport, this is how percentage of my hairs that are being shown. So I have it set to a density of 28. That doesn't mean they have 28 hairs. That just means it's like a local density value. And I'm only showing 38% of all my hairs. Usually I leave that at 100 until you get to like having a lot of hair. Down here, you could set the color of these primitives. If you set it to the default, it just has like this cool little brown Maya hair shader. If you come down here, we have our render settings. Let's go down to, okay, one second. Oh, okay. We have our renderer right here, and we can change that renderer. So we could set it to, right now we have Arnold settings, Arnold renderer. And if you were using RenderMan, you could set it to RenderMan. I'll cover that in a later video. We're not going to be rendering it for the time being, so we're not going to worry about it too much. Okay, under modifiers, this is a really important component of making a groom look good. We'll come back to here once we've edited our primitives, but this is going to be essentially adding things like noise, clumping, curls to make our hair look a little bit more natural. There's nothing under the grooming because we didn't do groomable splines, which are used for short fur. Underneath utilities, these are going to be things like essentially taking your groom and extracting like the guides to be curves, or can take curves that you made in like another program like ZBrush with fiber mesh. You can convert those to XGen guides. There's a lot of different little tools in here. They're not really related to the look of your groom. They're more for like, converting your groom or controlling your groom in a certain way that's kind of outside the normal XGen tools. So that's the basic settings we have here. We'll also see that in the outliner, we have these XGen files showing up here. We definitely don't want to mess with these too much. We don't want to delete them or anything like that, rename them. But you'll have like a collection folder, description folder, and then this is for, I think it's the collection of the guides that'll be created. Either that or it's the bind patch, I can't remember. When we save our file, so if we haven't saved our file yet, if we save our file, if we go into that project folder that we had set, we can come up here and you can see now we have this .xgen file. This .xgen file is essentially going to be saving all the settings inside this little window right here. And we'll get to this later, but when we generate texture maps, we're using something called ptex instead of UV-based maps. You guys are probably familiar with UV-based maps, which are just flat images that wrap onto our model. ptex is going to be based on the model itself. It's going to be kind of like vertex painting, so it like stores the information per polygon per vertex. And so you can't lay it out flat and look at it in like Photoshop. It wouldn't make any sense. But it also means that we don't really need UVs for that texture map. So XGen controls a lot of things through these special types of texture maps, these ptex maps. And so you can see XGen, collection, and then description. And then once we start making maps, you'll start to see folders pop in here with ptex files. If I go to my XGen test, we can look at, actually XGen test, there we go. We're in XGen demo. If you come in here, this one I've already made, right? And you can see I have all these different folders for different parts. And you can see for this mask, which is this one right here, you can see it's the name of my scalp. Hair, I said head underscore scalp, I should have said hair. But you can see on this other file, I named it hair underscore scalp. And so this ptex file is associated with that model file. Okay. So we'll come back here in a little bit once we start making maps, just to kind of take a look at those, but I'll just move that back there. Okay, so that's where those files are going to be stored. Okay, let's run through the primitives for my groom. So I'm going to cover all the basic ones. There's a couple other settings that we might come back to for specific types of grooms, like when we start using guides, there'll be like little guide tools that show up down here. But we're just using this really basic one for now. So generate primitives, we just want to keep that randomly across the surface. We'll change it later for if you're going to be you can change it later if you're going to be doing things like animation. You might want to do from XPD file, but we're just going to do a randomly across surface. Generator seed, this is like using a randomized function to generate random hairs. You can set a particular seed, right? And that's just going to give you a different type of generation. This is really not something you have to mess with unless like between different files or between different frames that you're rendering on like a render farm. If it's using a different seed, your hair is going to change. So you don't really have to think about that though. All right, so density is just going to be how dense our hair is, right? Our hair is going to be a lot thinner, so we'll come back up to this density. So it looks like a lot of hair or really dense hair, but this is actually not a whole lot of the hair. Feeling like Bob Ross. We don't have to mess with either of these settings here for now. We don't have to change. You can change like how it's being previewed, right? But I'm just going to worry about splines. It's the easiest way of looking at hair inside of the viewport. Control using attribute. Again, I'm not using guides, I'm just using attributes. I could switch it to guides if I wanted to. Let's see what that looks like really quickly. Okay, it looks like I thought it would. So you can see now I have my guide tools and I can actually add guides. I don't want to mess this up too much, so I'm going to go ahead and switch back to attributes to keep it there. This right here is going to be setting kind of like these preview hairs or even the XGen hairs that we create, like essentially how much resolution it has. We'll see that later on when we add modifiers on it. For now, we don't really need to mess with it. Length is going to be what you think it is, right? It's just controlling the average length of our hair. And then width is going to be how wide our hairs are. So, right, if I look at this, it depends on what you're using your XGen for. But this is going to be something that, this is about as thick as I'd probably want my hair to be. Probably want it to be a little bit thinner. In this case, I probably won't go too thin. Just because then I don't have to worry about too much hair. You'll notice, like, what happened? What XGen does is, it's very nice, is it looks at like your camera framing, right? Anything that's outside of it, it's going to cut it off, or it's not going to generate it, right? And so that's just going to keep your scene a little bit lighter. So if you ever see that and you're like, oh, what happened? You can zoom out a little bit and just re-preview it and it'll show you all the hairs again. Okay, so I made my hairs thinner, so I'm going to go ahead and make this a little bit denser. So I might go all the way up to like 400 or 500, right? There we go. If you're working on like a laptop, this might get a little heavy, so keep that in mind. We'll talk about controlling these hair lengths in a little bit. It's a little bit more annoying having to change this by just using attributes. It'd be easier if I was using guides, but we're not going to worry about that right now. All right, so we had the width, right? But the width is kind of controlled. I'm going to set that back to having a low value, 100, and then we can also turn on, anti-aliasing is actually on right now. So if I come out to here, if I turned off anti-aliasing, you see that looks way worse. So I guess we'll just have to live with it. Let's set that a little bit wider. So we're going to set this to 0.01. Actually, let's just go wide, 0.1. All right, and I'll bring this down lower just so you can see this a little bit easier. Here we have a width ramp, so this is changing the width of it along the length of the hair. This is really useful because, well, especially if you're doing something more stylized or you're not generating hair, but you're trying to make something else that has like a non-uniform shape, you might want to change that, right? So if I could come in here, right, you can see I'm changing the shapes of these hairs. But it's really useful for natural hairs where it usually kind of comes to a point or it gets thinner as it gets longer towards the end, right? So it's a little bit thicker at the base usually and a little bit thinner right there. So we have two settings that can do that, right? So width ramp is just going to give you full control of the width along the length of this object, right? You can see I'm changing the length of that. And then we also have taper. We'll look at taper in a second. Something that also you kind of want to do is you don't want to have your taper, generally speaking, go all the way down to 0, right? So you don't want it to go all the way down. You can get pretty low, but if it goes to 0, there's chances that it can kind of, get a little noisy. So yeah. So that's one way I could create this. I could also just set this to full width, and I could also use taper. Taper is going to be kind of doing the same thing, right? But it doesn't have this full control over the width. It's only the ends. And then so taper is going to be how much it kind of transitions to a point. Again, not going full 100% or 0. And then taper start's going to control when it starts transitioning, right? So you can see it's starting, it's full thickness here and it starts transitioning there. Okay. So that's basically, density, how much hair we have, width or length, how long our hairs are, width, how thin our hairs are, and then taper or width ramp, which is going to control the shape of our hair along its length. So I'm going to go ahead and set this width back down to a low value, 0.00, let's do 7, 007. And then I'll come up here to density. I'll set that back up to like 500. And it's still not dense enough, right? You can see a lot of in between, but that's good enough for me to look at. All right. So down here, we're going to get these different parameters right here. If you're using guides or even groomable splines, some of these might change. Usually what's going on is this is going to be rotating along the U and V direction on the UV layout. So tilt and in the U and V is going to essentially going to be rotating groups of hair. And then this one's going to be rotating them, right? So it's rotating around the normal. Be careful with Control Zing on this. It can be really, if you're messing with a tilt and you Control Z, it tends to like kind of like have a hard time calculating. It can kind of lock up a little bit. But you'll see if I tilt it, you know, it's going in one direction along the U or V. And then if I rotate it around the normal, it's taking the normal and then rotating them in that direction too. So you might think, you know, I don't want to use that. And generally speaking, yeah, you don't want to mess with it, but you could add a randomization value to these. And if you added a randomization value, each of the hairs would be slightly rotated to a different area. Again, it's not something I, would really mess with until you get kind of really comfortable with XGen. And then the bend parameters, I wouldn't mess with at all. That I would leave to being with groomable splines, but that's going to actually bend the hairs themselves. Down here is a region mask. It's going to be easier to talk about that when we look at painting maps. But what a region map is going to do is it's essentially going to let you split your hair into different directions, like a part in your hair. And then we're not going to really worry about displacement and calling for the purposes of these videos.